My name is Stephanie Wells, and I have been teaching radiography for about 20 years. And I have been teaching radiography the way that I learned radiography about 32 years before that. And so today we're going to talk about blended learning in the radiography curriculum and why I have made changes finally after 20 years. First, let's talk about medical residents. And you've probably all seen on television or maybe heard about how medical residents work up to 100 hours a week. And the argument for it staying that way forever was the people that were doctors already said, well, if they had to suffer that way, then everyone should have to suffer that way. But what you may not know is that in 2003, they actually reformed that practice. And so now I think it's only like 60 to 80 hours a week that they are actually required to work. And so the reform was made. The big question that came from the reform was when they measured patient outcomes between the residents that had worked 100 hours a week, little to no sleep, to the reformed residents, that the patient outcomes didn't actually change at all. So there were actually really good patient outcomes, even from the sleep-deprived medical residents. And so that just gave more fuel to the fire to the people out there advocating for the medical residents to have to be essentially tortured the same way that they were as students. And so, but what we weren't really surprised to hear about from that particular study was that even though the patient outcomes didn't change, that the student outcomes were a little bit better, that the students or the medical residents were healthier and happier than they had been with that ridiculous schedule that they worked. And so, we see that in teaching as well in education. So for 20 years, I've taught my course the same way that it had been taught to me. We had really good outcomes. Our students set for a national test. They passed their national test. We had a 100% pass rate for 19 of those 20 years. And so as a teacher, this is where we see change, the resistance to change happening. Well, if we still have good results at the end, then why should we change it? And so the argument is much the same as it is for the residents. And that is because it's not great for the students. And so we know now through education and principles and ideologies and research that there is a much better way to learn than 100 hours a week, or in my case, lecturing students for several hours a week and then setting them out essentially into the world. So if we know there's a better way and it's better for the students, then regardless of the outcomes, then we should change to that better way of doing things. And so for me, what that meant was, instead of continuing to teach in the exact same way that I have, even though ultimately the students do get what they need, we have transitioned now to an 8-week semester instead of a 16-week semester. And so the students are getting the same amount of content. They have the same amount of contact hours that they had for the 16-week semester. They just get it in 8 weeks now. So they're getting double time. Essentially, we're doing it in double the time. I mean, in half of the time. So we're giving them the same amount of content in half the time that they normally got it. So even though our outcomes essentially are still about the same, the students are absolutely miserable, and they are struggling to do what they need to do to be successful. So what does that? So what are we doing in the radiography curriculum to make a change? So I have decided to add blended learning, and I have added some of those elements already. And we have a plan to add multiple more elements across multiple different courses to connect those together. So with blended learning, students have more accessibility to the information. They have more flexibility in when they can access that information. We have added elements using the systems that we have in place. Our learning management system, they have software available. We're not adding any expense to the patient to the student, uh, but they have more opportunities for engagement. There are also more opportunities for collaboration. So we have multiple cohorts of students at different levels, and so we are adding elements so that they have more peer-to-peer interactions. Radiography is a very high-tech, fast-paced profession. And it's amazing that the profession can move as quickly as it does, and it is because it is technology based, but the education that we provide is still very much um, uh, in the traditional way of teaching. And so to combine these elements and add these elements into the program where they're learning the real world scenarios and ways, and it's very technology based and heavy, because that's what it's going to be when they graduate. It's not going to be, I'm going to sit and listen to a lecture. I'm going to have to be able to interact and use technology and tools and collaborate with people. So there's opportunities for continuous assessment in blended learning. Quizzes, self-assessment, peer assessment, even teacher assessment, but we're switching the way that we do things to, instead of me standing in front of a group of students and pouring into them, they instead are pouring into each other, and it's becoming much more learner-centered. And so, and that's really what blended learning is. So we create our learning objective, and then we have all of these other elements that work toward meeting that learning objective. And so there's group work, there's lab work, there's collaborative work across the different cohorts of students. They have that opportunity for enhanced engagement and flexibility in the learning. So before we had just face-to-face learning. Now we have this collaboration piece, which again, they do in the classroom, but they also do online with not only those classmates, but the other cohorts which are at different levels. And then they have the independent learning pieces where they can do online quizzes and self-assessments, and there is some software to reinforce some concepts. There's some simulation software in there. And so there's all of these other elements that more closely mirror what it's like in the real world in radiography as a profession. And so finally, after 20 years, we have, or I have realized that let's make this a little bit closer to what it looks like, because we still have good outcomes. This is not going to change our outcomes. If anything, it will make them better, but we have happier, healthier, more engaged students that are more learner-centered self-learners. And that is the ultimate goal, is to make these students self-learners, because they're, as fast as technology changes in the real world, it changes within the profession as well. And so they have to be willing to always expand and look to what's the next thing. Is there a better thing? Is there a better way to do things? And so that is the goal that we have here. And this is an excellent quote that is so indicative of what I'm talking about, which is we want to educate these students in a way that more mirrors the real world, because education is what survives when what has been learned has been forgotten. So you fall to the level of your training and not rise to the level of your expectation when you are learning. So I invite you to read my publication so you can learn how I have added these blended elements across the curriculum to help the students be more effective.